It was built over 4,400 years ago to honor the Egyptian pharaoh Sahura of the 5th dynasty. And now scientists have discovered secret rooms inside Sahura's pyramid that could reveal its ancient secrets. A team from Julius Maximilian's University of Wurzburg explored the monument as part of a conservation and restoration project. Their investigation uncovered a number of storage rooms that have not been documented before. This groundbreaking project represents a significant milestone in the understanding of the Sahura pyramid and its historical significance. Sahura's pyramid was built in the late 26th to 25th century BC for Sahura, also known as Sahur, the leading king, or the second king of the 5th dynasty, and the first king to be buried at Abusir. Sahura's reign was marked by peace and prosperity, according to ancient origins. Amongst other things, Sahura traded with foreign lands, developed a navy, and opened up mines. The pyramid was first excavated in 1836 by John Perring, an engineer working under Colonel Howard Vyse, before being explored further by Egyptologist Ludwig Borchardt in 1907. Now, more than 100 years later, scientists have stepped inside the ancient pyramid once again, and you can read more about Sahura's pyramid and the secret rooms in the news section of coasttocoastam.com. Back to more of my conversation with John Levi and David Edward, the authors of Evidence of the Old World, when Coast to Coast continues right after these. And we are back with David Edward, former special agent in the U.S. Army, author of, in the thriller and supernatural suspense genres, also the author of the nonfiction work Atlantis Solved, The Final Definitive Truth. And John Levi is here of the popular YouTube channel, John Levi, investigating historical mysteries. And together, they have published a brand new book just out the last couple of weeks called Evidence of the Old World. Now, I guess sort of mid-19th century into the late 19th century, we saw this explosion in something called the World's Fair, or international expositions in places like London and I think Paris, and later in Chicago in the 1890s, and then in San Francisco in 1894, the Midwinter Exposition. And I'm looking at the photographs, or not photographs. These are, some of them might be photos, but they look like drawings of these amazing edifices in San Francisco, for example, the Fine Arts Building that was built for the exposition there in 1894, the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, and the Electric Fountain. It looks like Versailles in Paris. And yet, again, utilizing, I guess, artificial intelligence, you kind of ran the numbers in terms of the logistics and these things getting built in terms of materials and labor costs and so forth. What did you come up with? What did you find out?
Well, we specifically dug into the 1894 Midwinter Fair in San Francisco. And I'll let John give an overview of the other fairs in a second. With this one, we picked it because it was a smaller fair, but its history, it has the most compressed history. So if anyone goes and looks and you go search for the history of this fair, you'll be told that the entire grounds were cleared and the entire fair, including these majestic buildings, were built in 4 months. And it logistically, that would be something that doesn't even seem possible under any circumstances, much less some story. And what we use the AI to do, because you can look at it, you can see these pictures, the thing is lit up. And this is right at the height of what they call the current war. So in 1893, the year before, is when they had the fair in Chicago, which is world famous. It's where Edison and Tesla competed to see who could offer electricity and all those things, and it's lit up. So we're talking this fair in San Francisco is not even a year later. It was put together in 4 months, but we can see it's lit up, and we use the AI to say, okay, let's try and figure out the space of this thing, the electrical infrastructure to be involved, the wattage of the batteries, and we go through all of that in the book in great detail. And what we discover is that it looks like the fair would need about 1 megawatt of power to light all of the lights up. A megawatt, to give you just a sense of it, is 1 megawatt of power can power 2 60-watt light bulbs for a year, just to give you a sense of what a megawatt is. So when you then project back into this time, though, and we can see a boiler annex, and they would have powered the electricity through coal. So we looked at the power transfer efficiency of coal. We looked at converting megawatts into megajoules, just doing all the math to get enough coal to light the fair for the 6 months we told it would have run. They would have needed 1,100 200,000-pound cars, train cars of coal a day. I mean, it's impossible. So
come again? How many? How many coal trains?
1,100 cars of coal, each holding 200,000 pounds of coal a day. 1,100 a day. It's
wow.
impossible. We can see what we have in the pictures. We have the pictures in the book, and anyone can really access them. 1894, we have an electrical display that is not possible given the narrative we have on what was going on with electricity and all of those things. And that's just one thing. When you take it out to the construction period and you look at plumbing, because they had big fountains and they had a lot of plumbing, and you look at just all the electrical cables, by the way, on the inside of those majestic buildings, Richard, that you were talking about, all of that's buried underground. The machine shop has electricity running to the exhibits. It's a monumental task. It would probably be impossible to do it in 4 months. What gets even more interesting there is we did a bunch of newspaper article searches, and we found references to the Midwinter Fair in years prior to 1894. So this goes to our overall theme that things don't seem to be in the right order. So if this Midwinter Fair was an event that happened every year, maybe they built it, over a number of years in the past, and then they had this event. We're not claiming the event didn't happen, just that the narrative leading up to the event doesn't make any sense. And so,
right, that it's impossible to have built. Again, I'm looking at the Mechanical Arts Building from 1894. This is a photograph. This is a massive a building. It looks like Hearst's Castle or something. It's magnificent. And they want us, and this is not a Potemkin village. I mean, this is not just a facade with nothing inside, like something out of the Truman Show. These were actual functioning buildings, go ahead.
And you can tell that. You can tell by looking at the photos that these are real buildings, but we're told that they're oftentimes temporary buildings. That's the strange part about the World's Fair. And even if they were temporary buildings, sometimes up to 200 of them. So it's one thing to have a one-year wonder for a building, a 1 million square foot building, but this is up to 200 buildings, as with the Chicago World's Fair.
Yeah, is that what they called White City? Was that Chicago in 1893? The White City. Again, incredible edifices. I'm trying to look at some of the U.S. government building of 1893. Again, that's the Chicago World's Fair. Again, I mean, it looks like St. James Cathedral or something on the Thames. That's Chicago in 1893. When was that supposedly built? In 4 months, too?
That one was a little longer. I think that one was about a year. But very short amount of time for 200 buildings that look like that. When you look at those pictures with that neoclassical design, there's no comprehending how it could be done in such a short amount of time, even if they were temporary buildings.
Why would you build something like that, for a temporary purpose? Something like that, if that was in Europe, that building would stand for 500 years.
Absolutely. Well, and there was one, in fact, in Paris, one of the first World's Fairs in the 1850s, and it's equally, if not more impressive than our American World's Fairs, and yet they all are. They all have this same feel, like a city, like a kingdom.
And all these buildings have been leveled. If I were to go to Chicago to the site of the 1893 World's Fair, do any of these buildings still exist? A few remain.
A few. It seems like a few remain in each city. They kept a few.
Have you run the numbers using
the,
AI? Sorry, go ahead, John. Finish your thought.
That, to me, the fact that some remain proves that they weren't temporary. They're made of the most perfect materials. Again, things that could stand the test of time, things that we would see in Rome or.
John, did you use AI did you run the numbers on, let's say, the 1894 International Exposition in San Francisco, the Midwinter Exposition, and again, these, the Fine Arts Building, the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, all of these incredibly huge Mechanical Arts Building, these edifices, did you run the numbers? Like, how much would it have cost? How much labor? How much material?
We did. We ran all those numbers. And it gets ridiculous. We're told that fair was built for, I don't have the number in front of me. It's less than $1 million total for everything. But what we did, we actually used AI, and we went out and we said, well, okay, how much, if there's electricity, they're running some kind of wire. Let's see, it's copper or whatever, zinc, whatever they're running that, the pipes for the plumbing, the building materials, and then just the labor, because a skilled laborer in 1894 made $2 a day, an unskilled one less than that. And you start to look at the spend and the effort that would have gone in.
Just the engineering. Just the engineering would have taken, wasn't it like 8 years, David?
Yeah, the architecture. Yeah, just the architecture. We said that they list one architect who, by the way, mysteriously died. They always mysteriously die. But yeah, just the architectural renderings, we call them renderings, the architectural drawings, clearing the land, it falls apart just putting foundations in place, much less planning for it, doing the architectural work of the different buildings. And on top of that, the architect that we're told designed that was also active designing the ferry building, which you can see at the end of Market Street in San Francisco. It's still there today. It's a hugely monstrous, famous building, and that was going on at the same time. So we're told he, I guess, quit doing that and started designing World's Fairs buildings in weeks instead of days and months. But yeah, the whole thing falls apart. The materials fall apart. Even I mentioned
the labor fell apart. Everything that the AI broke down fell apart. I mean, there wasn't enough money. I think it was 30 times what they told us it cost is what it would have cost in comparison to.
They told us about $1 million. It would have cost about $30 million in 1894 dollars, which is billions today. And we're told that this fair was done on a whim, and it opened in January of 1894, and by September we have pictures of them dismantling everything and selling the pieces and parts. Oh, the other thing we'd even mention, they built a giant man-made lake, supposedly. They put some type of reservoir on top of a hill and created a giant man-made waterfall that they would turn on and turn off to add water to the lake. And then they used that lake to recycle the water that went into the fountains that they had. Just those, you look at the technology from 1894 and you project what that project plan would look like. And it was like 2.5 years just to get the lake and the waterfall and everything built. So it's absolutely impossible that they did what they tell us. Now, we think, I guess, and the last piece, the forts that we see on these very, very, very early maps also look a lot like the buildings in this fair. It's the same type of buildings with the spires. Even in this fair, they also built an Eiffel Tower 3 years before the Eiffel Tower was built. It's a third of the height. They had a big spotlight on the top.
And the Eiffel Tower is actually part of the World's Fair in Paris.
Right.
Right. So, are there not photographs or I don't know, blueprints from the 1894? Like, can we not see photographs, kind of a timeline from 1893 in Chicago or 1894 in San Francisco, showing these buildings being built in stages, or do none exist? In other words, they were already there.
No. Well, so what we have, it's when you see a photograph. There's two kinds of old photographs. There's ones that come from catalogs, and the catalogs have a chain of custody. They usually have a stamp on them, and let's call those trusted. Although sometimes they're not. And then we have other photographs that we have to take a narrative. So someone has told us what the photograph is of. So in this particular fair, they have a photograph of the groundbreaking ceremony with what looks like tens of thousands of people somewhere on a hill or something. And then we're told immediately following that on the same day, they had about 50 horses and 20 ground. What are those things called, John? Ground scrapers? What were those things they were using?
Yeah, it was basically like a grader, like a grader on a horse.
Yeah, and they have this just lame picture of these guys supposedly grading a hill, but the trees are already gone, and it just, so we have those pictures, and then there are some pictures that look like the buildings are being built, but there's two things. The pattern we've identified is, first, and if anyone can find this, we are open to seeing it. We want to see a picture where they're working on the foundations, because so often in the pictures and in the narratives, everything seems to be built backwards. A lot of times, even the pictures you see, it looks like they're built top down. And the reason for that is that, for example, for this fair, we have pictures that are passed as construction pictures, but I have a forensic tool where I can look at some of the scans, and what we find is they're not the construction pictures, they're the disassembly pictures. So there's a picture of the machine shop that people say is the machine shop being built, but it's actually from September 1894, and it's actually the machine shop being dismantled, and then the pieces and the inner workings being sold for scrap and stuff. So
what's going on here? What's the the conclusion, or what are the questions? Why were they trying to pull a fast one on us? How long have these buildings been there? What are the other questions? What are the conclusions?
Well, so we're working towards a definitive conclusion. You have to be careful. There's a lot of speculation in this space. Here's what we can conclude right now. We can conclude that there is a pattern to our history, to the narrative of our history, that repeats itself over and over and over. We found what we call tags in the history, so there'll be specific things, specific parts of the narrative, like the number 200. A lot of these star forts, for example, we're told were built by 200 somethings, 200 leased slaves, 200 converted gold miners, those types of things. We see the 1 year tag associated with buildings that just look out of place and majestic. We see these mysterious architects who we're told work on 20 or 30 projects over 3 to 5 years and then die mysteriously. And those types of patterns repeat themselves everywhere. I have a theory, but it's...
Okay, I'm going to get you to share that theory when we come back, because we're approaching the bottom of the hour. David, we'll get to your theory in a moment. John Levi from the popular John Levi YouTube channel, exploring historical mysteries. David Edward, author, former special agent, special forces in the U.S. Army, and author of suspense thrillers. The new book, Evidence of the Old World. A recent study conducted by scientists from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and Rutgers University has revealed the New York City metropolitan area is slowly sinking. That's right, sinking at an average annual rate of 0.06 inches. This subsidence poses an increased risk of flooding to the region. New York State Governor Kathy Hochul declared a state of emergency due to heavy rain and flash floods in various boroughs of the city, underscoring the urgency of this issue. The study assessed vertical land motion from 2016 to 2023 using infometric synthetic aperture radar to examine changes in the region's topography. The sinking is particularly pronounced in areas that have undergone prior alterations to the Earth's surface, such as landfill construction and land reclamation. Notably, Arthur Ashe Stadium in Queens was built on a landfill, and it's sinking at a rate of 0.18 inches per year, while Woodside in Queens is rising at 0.27 inches per year. LaGuardia Airport is also sinking approximately 0.15 inches per year, prompting an $8 billion renovation to address existing issues and flooding concerns. Check out the story in the highlight carousel up at coasttocoastam.com. Back to my conversation with John Levi and David Edward, authors of Evidence of the Old World, and your calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. And we are back with John Levy, host of the John Levy YouTube channel, exploring historical anomalies and mysteries. David Edward, former special agent in the U.S. Army, author of Atlantis Solved, The Final Definitive Truth. The new book is Evidence of the Old World. And before the break, we were talking about these world fairs that took place across the world, really, Europe, the United States, beginning in the mid-19th century into the late 19th century, places like Chicago, San Francisco, London. And focusing on Chicago and San Francisco, these incredible edifices, grand buildings, massive grand buildings that were told built in as little as 4 months. And when you run the numbers, it's not feasible. The logistics just simply do not add up. And so, John, my question to you was, what's the takeaway here? Why? Is this a hoax being perpetrated on us? And if so, why? And you had a theory.
Well, it seems that I think the why is our history. There's another element to this where these buildings, oftentimes brick buildings, go down into the ground, and in ways that you would never build. You would never, put brick as a foundation. And there's another level to these buildings, which kind of lends to the idea that something happened. And I think that might be the why of the cover-up, maybe to hide that something has taken place in this realm as little as 150 years ago.
David, your theory?
Yeah, and I agree with John. It's so hard for us to frame this piece up. In the book, we just focus on providing the evidence that, history is kind of out of whack and it's not in the right order. My theory is similar to John's. It's a little more practical. And as far as I kind of am willing to go right now, let's assume that these map makers and all these maps, let's assume they're accurate, as opposed to assuming all of this evidence, just throwing it away because it doesn't fit with our narrative, which would mean that more was going on here in North America than our current history tells us. And when you look at the actors, obviously we have the English, we have the Spanish, we have the French, we have the American Indians. And it seems to me that if I were attempting to build the history of a country, I wouldn't necessarily want all these other actors. I wouldn't want the Spanish or the French or even the American Indians having a claim to these lands. And if there's massive cities and infrastructure and these buildings and all these things, if those exist, I think these other countries could have had a claim to these American lands. And instead, I think that the history, one possibility would be that the history was reworked to take that out of the narrative so that there were no claims to these lands. And what makes more sense? That San Francisco was built in a year, which is what we're basically told. It goes from nothing with 800 people to 80,000 people and a huge grid layout and everything in a year. Or that maybe 200 years ago, right, the Spanish or whoever on the coast populated the area, and it was slowly built out over time. If you give yourself 200 years to build these buildings and produce the brick and get your granite imported from China and all the things we're told, it makes complete sense with what we can see. When you condense it to 1 year, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, these structures, everything that we see from this era, is like the peak of a civilization and not the beginning of one. And when we look at these buildings, we're in awe. They take our breath away. And we see these old photos, the very first photos of the cities, and there's just horse and wagons, and the streets are mud. And then you see these buildings that just make no sense, just sophisticated elegance. And then a people, in some cases, the Old West, as with San Francisco. I mean, it should be the Old West, and we don't see that. And not to mention, the gold mining was taking place, what did you say, David? It was 100 miles away?
This is, it's so, we were just talking about this. In San Francisco, we're told, the 49ers, it was a boom town, gold was discovered in 1849. And finally, everyone's just told that. We just assume it. So John and I, we decided to look. And the gold was actually found 120 miles away in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And when you look at the topography and the geology, it wouldn't have been Sacramento. If you take the bridges out, it wouldn't have been San Francisco. If you take the bridges out, San Francisco is in a ridiculous place without bridges. And you would have had to go across these mountains with the gold. It doesn't make any sense. What would have happened is Reno and Sacramento would have boomed. But instead, we're told San Francisco boomed, even though it was really even unrelated to the gold rush. So, and the last piece I want to get out there is when you look at, we didn't get to the American Indian Wars and all of that, and of course there's a lot of pop culture around that. But we even have anomalies when you start to look at what the early Europeans called the indigenous American people. One of the first wars with the Indians, the Europeans named it King Philip's War. Well, and as Americans, and of course slightly more polite Canadians, we don't really know history, so we hear King Philip's, and we just assume that must have been some European king. That was the name of the indigenous leader. And other little things in history, like we all know the name Pocahontas, right? And there's stories about her. She was actually called Lady Rebecca. And so when you dig into all of this,
Lady Rebecca.
Yeah, you can absolutely look it up. And so what happens is we see the edges of a history, and we see the hintings and shadows on maps that North America was just like everywhere else, which actually makes sense. The last thing with the Indian Wars, you can look. It took 300 years for the Europeans to, and there was dozens, if not hundreds, of named skirmishes and wars and battles with the indigenous peoples that were in North America, but it took 300 years to move from the East Coast to the West Coast as they fought their way through against, what we call them American Indians or whatever it is. But 300 years, kind of in pop culture, we're told that these evil Europeans showed up with more advanced technology and killed all the peace-loving hippie Indians. That's not actually the case. The Indians gave as good as they got, and in many cases beat the Europeans. It took forever. So again, we're looking at, when you look at the actual history, the technology levels are much more equal, and it seems like the old maps tell us a lot more was going on here in North America than our history.
All right. Let's go to the phones, and let's begin with a first-time caller. Sam is in Arleta, California. Sam, good evening. Welcome to Coast.
Hello, hi.
Hi there. Go ahead.
I just had a few questions. Do you think the technological advances that could have been in North America before they got there came from primarily extraterrestrial angelic resources, kind of like how we see Machu Picchu or the pyramids are much bigger than we'd expect for the times that they were supposedly built in?
All right, let's leave it there because I've got some callers, and let's leave it to the one question, and that's a good one, Sam. John, David, your thoughts on who built these things?
Yeah, I think it's similar to what we see with Machu Picchu and the pyramids and anything else, that we have something very advanced going on, and we don't seem to have that same technology today. But we've just pulled it back to 150 years, and we see the same story. So it's very similar.
All right. Thank you, Sam. I want to move along here and get as many as we can in. East of the Rockies, Jeff is in Nebraska. Jeff, welcome to Coast AM.
Good evening, gentlemen. I never hear anybody talk about the huge expo they had at the same time period here in Omaha, Nebraska. I mean, it was a monster. They said Absolutely. It actually rivaled the Chicago World's Fair. I believe it was called the Trans-Mississippi Expo.
Yep.
And it did the exact same thing. I mean, it looked like Vienna. They dug dirt up, made like canals, big lakes, monster buildings. Occasionally, they'll still run into foundations from it. They're doing street repair. But the only thing that's still lasting are about these 100-some-odd-foot tall sycamore trees. I'm talking with my grandfather. He said there was a few left, but he said it rivaled Chicago. And there's a wealth of photographic evidence and pictures and stuff down here in Omaha that might help you explore other areas.
Great question or comment, Jeff. Thank you. Yeah, why would you go to all that trouble to build these beautiful structures and then just tear them down? when they could have stood for 500 years.
It doesn't make
yeah,
sense.
go ahead, David.
Omaha, St. Louis, Knoxville. Yeah, there's when you actually dig into these world fairs, and the caller was right, they're everywhere. And what's exceptionally weird, John has done a lot of this research in his videos, is we can kind of see on these old maps cities, and you can kind of line them up to places like Omaha and St. Louis and Chicago and San Francisco. And so it feels like the evidence is there. And what I think happens is this is a way to catalog, because they produce a lot of documentation off of these fairs. I have a lot of the books here, and they catalog it, and then they sell all this technology off. I think these world fairs were really auctions where they're selling off the remnants of whatever this prior society was.
West of the Rockies, Howard is in Vancouver, Washington. Howard, welcome to Coast.
Thank you, Richard. I have a question for John and David. Earlier in the conversation, you were describing these star forts, these mysterious structures that are apparently located on both the east and west coast. Now, I have to wonder, these sound like some rather formidable defensive fortifications. And the question comes up in my mind, just exactly who or what were they defending themselves against?
Good question.
Yeah, this time period, so these star forts, they're basically something called the third system design. And the narrative is that after the War of 1812, the U.S. Military decided that they needed, better coastal defenses. They're almost exclusively on the East Coast. The only one, arguably the only real one on the West Coast, is the Fort Point in San Francisco. What's interesting, you mentioned who are they defending against. We catalog this in the book. We go through about 8 of these star forts, and they all failed. Like Fort Morgan is close to me. I've been studying. I've been there many times. Fort Morgan was supposedly built with 30 million cubic tons of brick-making material by 200 leased slaves after the War of 1812. And, of course, it fell during the very beginning of the American Civil War. And most of these star forts, not all of them, most of them fell militarily. So they don't have any military value, even though we're told that it was a military exercise and a third system design and a lot of logic and logistics and expense that went into it. But whatever they were defending, if they were for defense, they were terrible at that job. So they were probably for something else, we think.
And really, they are logistically impossible to build in this time period, especially when you consider Fort Jefferson off the south tip of Florida. 16 million bricks in the water today, and it just makes no sense. What are you defending? The war is on the mainland.
All right, we are rapidly running out of time here, but again, the book, Evidence of the Old World, it's available as a paperback at Amazon, and it quickly went to number 1 in the category, and even ahead of Graham Hancock's Fingerprints of the Gods and von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods. Quite an accomplishment for such a short time. And again, the database you encourage people to go to is althist, as in alternate history, althist.com, and then select the link at the top called Old World Catalog. John and David, fascinating. We're going to have to follow up on this, I think, with another show. There's so much more to discuss. Thank you both.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you always for having us, Richard. Very much appreciated.
My pleasure. All right. When we come back, humanoids and high strangeness. Preston Dennett returns to the program, and we'll get into some of the 20 true UFO encounters in his new book. Coast to Coast continues right after these.